Good day, everyone. I'm Partha Mishra, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's episode of EncoraTalks, Multi-Cloud Cost Management with FinOps. Over the next 35 minutes, we will discuss the what, why, and how of implementing a robust multi-cloud FinOps strategy. I will share insights on leveraging FinOps principles to optimize expenditure across diverse cloud providers. Now, a bit about myself. With over 2 decades of extensive industry experience spanning various domains and global data landscapes, I work as a solutions director at Encora. My skill set encompasses multi cloud DevOps, security, FinOps, and data architecture. At Encora, I spearhead strategic initiatives in data and analytics. So let's jump right into the multi cloud landscape that we have today, right? As you can see in the representation to the left side, around 90% of the enterprise customers are multi-cloud, right? And they have at least 2 or 3 clouds that they work on. Rest of them are typically a single cloud users. It could be the private ones or the single public. And those scenarios are typically the ones with the regulated industry or government clouds and things like that. But for the majority of the customers, what we see is that they use at least 3 different clouds. In fact, 3.4 is the average. Now, when cloud first appeared, we were all elated that the increased elasticity and pay-as-you-go model is going to, be a great benefit, and therefore any cloud would have sufficed, right? But as we go ahead, we see that different clouds actually come up with their own set of innovations and their own set of frameworks, which kind of pick up, for example, ChatGPT on Azure, and then Vertex AI or even TensorFlow packages on GCP, right? And AWS kind of started it all with their SQS queuing. So when these kind of innovations happen and new products come into the market, different departments of the same organization might be using different clouds for their own purposes. Add to that the acquisitions and mergers that bring in their own set of cloud tools, right? And so ultimately, for big organizations, we find that there are many, many different tool sets from different clouds that have come in and that are coexisting, right? What happens is with time, the billing aspects of these services became opaque, right? It's very difficult to figure out what's going on in each of the clouds and put them together under a single pane of glass, right? That's what we are going to talk about in terms of, although multi-cloud offers us increased agility and flexibility, right? And we can pick and choose the frameworks that are best in each of them. The place where it lacks is that it's extremely difficult to figure out what is getting expended where, and where there are opportunities for optimization and things like that, right? And that is the place where we need to discuss about FinOps, right? And FinOps, quite in the lines of our DevOps or MLOps, right? It's another cultural shift, right? It's an operational framework that promotes financial accountability and cost optimization. In fact, cost optimization in many of the cases can be the target that we want to achieve, but the way to get into that is through greater financial accountability. Let's talk about 3 core principles of FinOps. The first one is cost optimization. Since we are starting with so finance is the main focus there. And what we're going to look into that is how can I optimize the cost? How can I reduce the overspending? In fact, there's more than 20 billion a year overspending on the cloud. right? So there's a huge opportunity for every single customer to optimize their cost. That also improves their resource utilization, right? So which means I'm actually utilizing more percentage of the resources that I have provisioned, right? The second part is really governance. With multi-cloud and in fact different departments of the same corporation or same enterprise being on many different clouds, it's extremely difficult to govern it properly, right? To put together a set of policies and procedures in terms of how people are going to use it, right? um, all of us who have been using cloud know that, to begin with, we should put in some tags and labels across the resources that we create and then use it, which can still be okay for a single cloud. But how do we handle it for multiple clouds, right? The tag framework for GCP is very different from AWS, and Azure actually doesn't even have it. You get it as additional information in the billing data, right? So it's not easy, and it's really important that we go back and come up with a particular set of procedures and processes to make sure that the resources that we're using are governed properly. And the third part is chargeback, right? Even though the different departments are internal to the company, it's very important to understand who is spending how much, right? And that's really the starting point, because first we need to have the visibility of who is spending how much, and then we can uh, dive into the details, double click on things, and see which resources are probably coming from an older generation, some of the legacy ones, which ones are supposed to be phased out, and which ones are supposed to be re-architected or re-engineered, right? So looking into these three core principles of FinOps, let's look into the type of cloud chaos that we are talking about, right? So whether we are in a single cloud or multiple cloud, the constant factor is that it costs, right? And whatever costs can be optimized, right? So before optimization, let's look into what kind of chaos we get into. Here are some examples of that. I'm just taking AWS, Azure, and GCP, in parallel. We can also bring in the Oracle Cloud and the IBM Bluemix. But if you really look at it, you'll find many different names for the very same thing. For example, on-demand instances on AWS are really the pay-as-you-go on Azure, and then on-demand pricing on GCP, right? Even the types of discounts are very different. So committed use discounts on GCP, and there are reservations in Azure, and there are obviously reserved instances on AWS. To add to that, when we get this information, the billing data, they look very different. The GCP credits structure is actually an array structure with different fields into it, right? It's a nested array. On AWS and Azure, those are simpler fields, right? So, so this actually conveys two different things. One, the type of structure for the pricing are very different. We did not even start talking about many other services and the SaaS pricing and some of the PaaS pricing, right? Of the this EMR cluster, how does it get priced? Or the cloud functions, how do they get priced? And the Lambda, right? And the second part is how that data actually comes into the billing extracts, right? On which we can then double click and analyze. It's not really that easy to figure things out, right? So once we understand the an extent of the chaos that we see in multi-cloud, we should also now focus on the clarity, right? What is important here is to arrive at a cost visibility which is unified in nature, right? So what we need to do is find a consolidated view, and I'm actually going to talk about one sample architecture or a reference solution that you can take with you in terms of how we can arrive at this cost visibility. But what we need here is a single view in which we can bring in the billing export data or the billing data from multiple clouds, right? And it's much easier said than done, because not only the definition of the costs are different, but also the representations are different. Then the second part is a standardized reporting. Although this kind of varies from organization to organization, depending on what they put more stress on, the prioritize on, it is important to have some kind of standard arrived at. So, for example, uh, a simple, um, you know, simple dashboard with different clouds to be selected, and based on the cloud, if we can change the cost values that appear, that gives us some idea. But it's even better if we can have a single graph that represents costs for a particular aspect into three different areas on the same graph, right? That way we can cross check which comparable service is costing more in a particular cloud and less on other. Remember that this actually depends on the mix of the services and technologies that a corporation is using from different clouds. Right? It's not an overall cloud cost. It's based on the usage. So for some customer, maybe they have a lot of lift and shift workloads and they have to use VMs, and then there's a specific duration of these VMs per year that needs to be used, and maybe they are not using a reserved instance or a committed use discount in GCP, right? So these kind of graphs can actually help them understand how they can shift their focus in terms of usage of the resources. And that's the third part here, which is the actionable insights that we're talking about, right? So this really helps us get into those certain small points that can make a large difference in terms of spending. Because if you find out these areas that are not yet leveraged in terms of pricing, and then you implement that over the time, it's actually going to give you a huge amount of benefit. And that's something that is consistently seen at our different customers, right? A quick look at the FinOps team. We hear this question from the customers a lot of time in terms of, you know, so if you remember when the DevOps and SRE culture came in place, people started talking about the skill sets that the people need to have. Any ops kinds of teams come with their own type of skill sets. FinOps is no different. It has its own set of skill set, because what we're talking about is engineers or architects or designers. When they create their product, they need to have the thought process of the finance guys in mind, right? So at one end, we need to have the cloud expertise to understand the nuances of pricing in the different clouds. On the other hand, we are talking about cost management skills and financial understanding of stuff. Plus, the communication and collaboration in this case becomes a little more important. From another aspect, is that everybody needs to have a common ground in terms of understanding of what it means for their designs and implementations in terms of their financial aspects, right? What it means to optimize, right? An optimization can have two different aspects, one being technical, another being financial, and to bring them together is not that easy. Plus, there has to be another type of data analysis capabilities. For example, in MLOps, we do analysis of data in terms of feature engineering. In this case, we need to do analysis of data in terms of financial engineering to figure out, if there is a savings that's coming out of a particular cloud, then how do I distribute that savings across many different costs that I have accrued on that cloud, right? So that's also a little different skill that's needed. But this slide comes in very handy, especially for the organizations that are embarking on creating a new FinOps team and trying to bring in those skill sets that are going to help them optimize and save a lot of wasted revenue or wasted cost in the long run. um, Going into some of the best practices for FinOps, and this slide can actually help us, as a checklist in different areas, and also remind us of the three steps that we can take here. And those steps are really inform, optimize, and operate, right? The inform part is about coming up with the right dashboards and visualizations and reports to understand what's happening in the landscape, right? Especially the areas that can be optimized, and then figure out some action points, right? And when we figure out these action points, we can optimize on those areas. For example, some of these areas are very easy to look at, like a right sizing of the resources, right? Or deduplication of the workloads, removing some of the waste. For example, keeping data stored as archive is okay, and it is probably necessary for compliance purposes. But an organization typically doesn't have a lot of data for compliance purposes. I mean, if you take it as a percentage, maybe 10% of the data is needed for the compliance purposes, right? But we have seen, all types of logs and input data sets being, saved, and in maybe in the cold zone or in the archive layer, just for the sake of it, because people don't know what to do with it, right? And there are even very, very easier steps such as lifecycle policies that can be applied in terms of removing these data sets after a certain amount of time, right? So if we are expecting this data to be utilized for, let's say, another 6 months or even 1 year, we can create our lifecycle policies in that way and make sure that when this data reaches at the end of its lifecycle stage, it is removed, right? There can be many other optimization areas. This just serves as a set of steps that are easy to spot. And talking about that, spot instances is a big part in optimization. For large workloads that can sustain downtime in terms of a single machine going down and then rejoining there, it is important to have some of the machines that are reliable, maybe on demand instances, but many of the other machines to be spot instances. That drives down the cost by around 40 to 70% anytime, right? And each cloud also has its own nuances of how you can save costs. For example, the committed use discounts, right? If we can identify some workload that's going to run for multiple months or years or multiple years, right? And we often see this, that customers have their workloads that are running for a very long time, but they have never taken that effort to segregate these kind of workloads. Because once you segregate, then you can take some actions in terms of how you can utilize the committed use discounts or the savings plans, and then drive down your cost, right? And the third part here is operate. And operate really talks about, once we have brought some optimization features, how do we go from here, right? So how do I automate my processes in terms of generating reports to figure out what was the change after doing the optimization, right? There has to be a change that we see in the actual cost, right? So there has to be an automated reports coming out after, let's say, every month or every quarter, and that should show us that we have actually driven the cost down, right? We need to revisit the budgets and forecasts, because now this has to be less. I mean, there's no point in bringing in some optimization features if you are not really expecting to revisit the budgets, right? And at the end, we really need to drive the whole team towards the FinOps culture, right? A culture where the team itself organizes around the FinOps principles and uh, re reworks on the optimization of whatever they're doing. Okay, let's look at some of the some of the specific examples here. This is to just give you a head start in terms of how do we prioritize which one to optimize. In this diagram, if you look at the bottom, we see the savings going from low to high, from left to right, and the effort again going from low to high, from bottom to up, right? So what that means is, in the bottom left quadrant, these activities need low effort and the savings are also low, right? But if you really look at the top left quadrant, where we have right sizing, right? This is one that needs probably higher effort, with lower savings, right? So this is probably a lower priority item for us. The bottom right could be a high priority item because this needs low effort, but the savings are high. For example, again, I'm going to right sizing, but the difference that you will see here is that right sizing at the pre-deployment gives us really higher savings vis-a-vis the effort needed when compared to right sizing at the post-deployment, which is in the top left quadrant, right? We can see some of the other areas such as auto scaling or BigQuery slots, which is relevant for GCP, which falls into the bottom right quadrant, right? So this is just an example. We help our customers actually create a very extensive diagram like this with all the different things that we figure out from their billing data, and then put those activities in this specific quadrant, and then pick those up, typically from the low effort high savings area, and then based on the time scarcity, either go into the low effort low savings or high effort high savings capacity, right? And this is a very, very easier and important way to put in the Pareto principles into the execution, and harvest the savings from here. Some more important aspects of implementing FinOps, right? One such aspect is the maturity steps, right? So once we start implementing FinOps into an organization, it's not that we can fully automate stuff and then harvest the benefits out of it. It's typically takes three different stages with a crawl, walk, and run. This comes from the maturity model of FinOps. And while in the crawl stage, the KPIs could be very basic. In the walk stage, we might have automated some of the areas, and medium to high level KPIs is what we are measuring. And the run stage, it's kind of fully automated. Although this is the time when we can bring in another new workload. So let's say if we have integrated FinOps for three different clouds, and now it's time to bring in another one, or if we have a hybrid scenario, we can bring in the that on-prem billing information as well at this stage. But as you can see, it is important to adjust our KPIs in these maturity lines. So when we are crawling, we should not be looking at a very high value of these KPIs, because that is only going to demotivate us. This path is not really something that can be achieved in at one stage. This has to be done through stages, and crawl, walk, run is a really, really good paradigm to adopt and take the FinOps implementations to a good maturity level. Moving on to the next one, this is an illustration to show how it might look like in terms of a solution, right? So this can be applied as a reference solution if you have cloud infrastructure of similar nature. What we're talking about here is in the left side, we are looking at three different clouds. One, the top one being GCP, and the next one is Azure, and the one after that, below that, is AWS, right? And we are automating our processes using Terraform, which is showing up at the bottom. Now, if you look at this, the billing extracts from both Azure and AWS are coming to the S3 buckets or the containers, respectively. And then we can bring in this data with a create blob trigger through a Lambda function on AWS or an Azure function on Azure, and bring them into GCP. That's the solution architecture we have here. We can actually have a destination cloud as either of them. In this case, we are talking about having GCP as a destination cloud. On the other hand, the billing extracts of GCP can directly come into BigQuery. Right? So we are not really converting that into a data set or a data in the GCS bucket, but then we are directly having those tables as tables or views on BigQuery. And the right hand side, in the destination zone, the blue zone, we are doing our entire analysis and unification of the schema using BigQuery. This reference architecture actually talks about utilizing quite a classic medallion architecture with its bronze, silver, and gold zones. Although we have added a couple more layers before that. The first one is landing, which is really trying to create external tables out of the sources, and the next one is raw, which sometimes helps us with column subselection, and that is very much important because some of the columns are not consistent in all these clouds. The cost structures or the cost records in these clouds actually can be at different granularity level, right? So and even the logical grouping can be different. For example, project is there in GCP, but it's not there in AWS or Azure, while Azure has resource groups and the other clouds don't have it, right? So it's important to take care of those differences at the raw zone. But our purpose is that at the gold zone, we are going to have the all the billing exports consolidated into a unified billing schema, and maybe some views exposed for consumption into dashboards such as Looker, or can be other visualization tools, and also some aggregation tables over there. Just for reference, I have included Dataform as a tool for pipelines in terms of CI/CD as well as transformation (ELT) process, and using Git for source repository. Right. If you have multiple clouds, let's say Azure, AWS, GCP, and you are looking for creating the unified processing and unified schema and GCP for FinOps, you can directly take this as a reference architecture and go ahead. Okay. Now, since we are through with that, there is an important aspect that I need to touch upon. So just like any other ops, could be SRE, FinOps also, is a shift of culture, is a shift of mindset, right? When we discuss with different customer teams and we implement FinOps for them, or we help them create teams for their FinOps practices, what we want to bring in is that the FinOps matrices that we are going to collect and that we are going to analyze has to become a part of any other metrics that the team captures and reviews, right? This has to be something that has to inculcate in their design reviews, for example, and their architecture reviews, because based on the decisions that are taken during architecture or during design, right, they have far reaching implications when cost is concerned, right, or when just the way it has implications on quality or availability. Although those are separate dimensions, it also has huge impact on cost, right? So the cost related KPIs and matrices that we were looking at when we talked about the maturity of crawl, walk, run, those have to be incorporated, and the leadership should also be actively involved in terms of recognizing the champions of FinOps, and you know figuring out how the FinOps team is contributing, and then realizing the potential of the savings, right? So it really has to be a culture which is a more cost aware culture, right? Just because there are cloud, just because we can do pay as you go, doesn't mean that we are always optimizing on it, and it is our responsibility to take the best advantage of cloud and optimize the cost, right? A good reference that I would encourage everybody to look into is the FinOps Foundation. There you will find the different FinOps principles, the domains and capabilities that are segregated there, how the FinOps practice can be managed, the different phases, inform, optimize, operate that we just talked about, and the maturity levels of crawl, walk, run, and the different personas that are associated with it. Also, you will find a set of specifications, which is called focus, that can give you a good, starting point in terms of what a unified billings schema or the field should look like, right? It is it is a good starting point, although you will have your own set of fields, right, apart from the ones that are defined there, and it is so much important to adapt to what you need, but a good starting point can be found in the FinOps specifications. Let's quickly talk about a couple of success stories that I would like to highlight, or at least once. The first one is about a leading real estate company, and they had their infrastructure in both on-prem and multi-cloud. Now, they were into a good scenario where their customer base was expanding rapidly, but then with that, they were also trying to move their workloads from on-prem to cloud as usual to take advantage of the elasticity and pay-as-you-go model. But what they have seen is that while doing this, they were putting so much of stress on lift and shift, and that really resulted in a lot of wastage of their resources. Now, did they have a good view of what they were using, how much they were utilizing, and how much they were wasting? No. So that's where we came in, and we helped them get into their FinOps culture. We helped them create a team, and with us, that team then learned how to analyze the cost and then figure out those ways where we can optimize. And in fact, in the typical migration process, we help them re-architect, re-engineer, and even in some cases retire some of their workloads, right? And then help them optimize the stuff. But it all started with a very small changes, where we figure out that in certain cases they could have just gone with a bring your own license approach. For some of the long running processes, they could have just gone ahead with reserved instances and things like that, right? So with that, we could bring in significant amount of savings and much more efficiency in operations in terms of time to market that they can go ahead with for this customer. And the next one that I wanted to talk about is actually a leading logistics and shipping company, which was using a hub and spoke model across many of its subsidiaries and different departments and groups. The problem is that all these different groups or the spokes were actually using different clouds, and the hub did not have much of a visibility of what they're using, right? And this actually was a very quick win once we could fit in their FinOps, reports and the team structure. Because what happened is they were very quickly able to realize the areas in which they can optimize their cost, right? So we could very well figure out the three clouds that they were using and the workloads that are running there, and iteratively we worked with them to make sure that some of the services that are getting used are actually deduplicated, and some of the tons of workloads that they were using on Kubernetes, for example, in many different clouds, that could have been brought together, and that's what we did. And we improved their utilization of resources by over 40% in that, and drastically reducing their cost in the cloud. This was really a good case where we helped the customer improve their optimized cost structure by a high amount. Okay. um, I think, yeah, with this, it's a wrap for today's session. And let's take it if there are any questions from the audience here. Okay, so I see the first question as what are the biggest challenges companies face when migrating to the cloud from a cost perspective? This is a good question. Um, Now, obviously, companies that are migrating for the first time, right? They still have that on-prem, Excels and cost spreadsheets with them, right? And those spreadsheets were actually created for predicting the peak demand, right? The peak cost. So these migrations typically end up in over provisioning of the resources, because all their estimation worksheets are actually towards peak workload, right? You don't really have to do that for cloud, but it's just that you don't have any other tools with you, right? The second part is lack of visibility. For the on-prem infrastructure, the customers typically had people or teams that were looking into different aspects of the infrastructure from the very beginning or for a long time, right? Now if you suddenly move that into a cloud infrastructure, you need to realize that you need a separate infrastructure for visibility, and it's more than infrastructure. The tools are already there, but you will have to plug them together into the right places and bring them into the right dashboards to get the visibility of it, right? So these two are the top the top problems that we see. And the third one is, of course, the skills gap, because moving from on-prem to cloud is a huge shift in terms of the skills that is needed in the team, right? So these three challenges are the ones that we see as the biggest ones that the customers typically face. Another question here: how can we measure the success of our FinOps initiatives? Well, this is a good question, because the success really can be multidimensional, right? So first of all, the main purpose of FinOps initiative is to optimize cost. So reduction in the cost is typically the first KPI that we are going to measure, right? And higher utilization of the resources, which comes as a direct product of that. And these are typical KPIs that we find in the FinOps initiatives, right? And these are the typical measures. Now, apart from that, we also find customer satisfaction. I mean, where there is a reduction in cost, the customer is going to be happy, right? Plus, we also find that inside the team, there is more awareness towards optimized cloud architecture and optimized cloud design, because now they understand that just going with what sounds good as a technology or service is not good enough, right? It's important to iterate over their existing architecture and design and go with an optimized version of it, right? So what we typically see is that at least 15 to 20% of the time there is a better there's a better iteration in time to market. There's a significant reduction in time to market. That's what we get, right? It's also important to note that these benefits don't just come automatically, right? It's important to set very clear goals and benchmarks for ourselves and continuously refine those as we move from the different maturity levels of crawl, walk, and run. And therefore we have to review and refine these goals and benchmarks and the KPIs that we are into. I hope that answers the question. Okay, this one's interesting. Beyond cost savings, how does a FinOps culture benefit an organization? And this is probably the most important thing, because once we understand and we are convinced about the benefits of FinOps, we are typically going to implement that, create a team, and then we go ahead, get some reports out, and then find out areas of optimization, and then implement and operate that, right? But the culture, the shift in culture that happens, that goes far beyond that, right? This actually brings in a sense of shared responsibility, and this is what we've seen in many of the customer implementations that we are part of, right? This actually increases the collaboration and shared responsibility inside the team members, right? Because in one team there could be five different groups or five different sets of people working on different things, but now they understand that if they really have to optimize and not in their own areas, right? If they really have to optimize, if they work together, optimization is much better, right? They can cross utilize their resources. The second case study that I was talking about, where we could find out that each individual hub or spoke were using their own Kubernetes cluster in their own ways, right? Some of them actually had a different type of CI/CD workflows, or their container runtimes were different and whatnot, which were okay for those um, you know individual departments. But it is also important that they all come together, right, and leverage those areas of optimization that you cannot figure out individually, right? And we have seen a really high amount of sense of responsibility and collaboration that goes in, right? The second part is, of course, the automation, automated process, and continuous improvement. This is another area where having a FinOps culture really pushes you towards it, right? So the teams are continuously challenged towards finding improvement opportunities and also implement automations that takes them to do this continuous improvement. It could be through a CI/CD process, could be a tweak in the ops process, or maybe bringing in the DevSecOps and merging it with FinOps. There are many different innovations that we've seen. But what is important is that this really brings in that focus of a continuous improvement, right? 1% improvement in cost or 1% improvement in saving um, actually results in a really high saving, overall saving over the year, right? That actually frees up the budget for the next year, or for the next set of things, or for the next activities in the backlog, right? And apart from that, there are other benefits, some tangible, some intangible, in terms of how agile teams are. But those actually come as, secondary benefits from improved collaboration and continuous improvement in that process, right? Okay. All right. So with that, it's time to wrap up. So thank you, everyone. I want to express my sincere gratitude to each one of you for joining me on this webinar today. For more insightful content, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Encora Inc. There you will find a treasure trove of webinars and discussions, right? And of course, for more updates, visit our website at encora.com. Thank you so much, everyone.